Oral questions. Questions orales. Honorable Leader of the Opposition, soon to be next Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Poilievre. Here we go.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal bloc, they have doubled the debt, increased taxes. After these 9 years, seniors are struggling to pay the bills. Record numbers of seniors have to go to food banks to eat. They're struggling to pay rent since the cost of housing has doubled. Their children and grandchildren can't buy a home like they would have been able to in other times. Will the government accept our common sense plan? We want to fix the budget and axe the tax so that our seniors can pay their bills with dignity. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, seniors in Canada remember very well what Conservative policy for seniors were. They remember that in Davos, Prime Minister Harper announced that he would increase the retirement age from 65 to 67. As for grandchildren, seniors support our national daycare program for their grandchildren. We will work for them and for their grandchildren. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois leader keeps picking fights and squabbling with the government of Quebec. Instead, he should be defending the nation of Quebec. But rather than doing so, he says he's happy that the forestry sector is under threat. Quebec's Environment Minister said the opposite, though. He said, I would like the Bloc Québécois to defend us more strongly than they are currently. Will the Prime Minister listen to those who really truly have common sense and permanently reverse this decree? The Honourable Public Services and Procurement Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative leader talks about squabbles. Well, he's picked a fight with each and every single municipality in Quebec. He's called mayors incompetent. Will he finally apologize for calling municipalities, their employees, incompetent? When he was Minister of Housing, he built a grand total of 6 housing units.
I just don't see how that's true.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, I would ask you to please
someone's in
leave
trouble.
the floor to those who are recognized by the chair. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Carbon tax carney became conflict of interest carney when the Prime Minister named him to be effectively the phantom finance minister to advise on economic policy while he presides over a massive multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation that sought 10 billion Canadian tax dollars to take over our pension system. He's got a $2 billion loan for a friend, and now we learn that the economic task force he heads up has only one person. Isn't he a walking, talking conflict of interest?
Yeah. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we are glad to get economic advice from smart former Canadian central bankers like Mark Carney and like Steve Pelosi, who is doing some great work advising us on how to encourage Canadian pension funds to invest more in Canada. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, on that side of the House, they get their foreign policy advice from Elon Musk and from Tucker Carlson. They should be ashamed of themselves. The people of Ukraine certainly know what's going on.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
That's a weird thing to say.
Madam Speaker, today the Premier, Mr. Speaker, today the very courageous and common sense Premier of New Brunswick launched a renewed lawsuit against the quadrupling carbon tax. He's pointing out that this carbon tax will force the layoff of nurses, doctors, and teachers because of the extra cost it imposes on operating schools and hospitals. Instead of requiring courts to decide on the quadrupling carbon tax, why won't the Prime Minister let the people decide in a carbon tax election?
Yeah. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
I am so glad that the Leader of the Opposition gives me an opportunity to talk about the price on pollution, because we made a great announcement just a few minutes ago, and that is that small businesses in the province of New Brunswick that he was talking about that have 499 employees are going to get rebates of $43,413. In the province of Ontario that we both represent, a business of 499 employees can get a rebate of nearly $300,000. They're going to get that money directly in their bank accounts by the end of the year.
There is not one single business owner that's thriving under Liberal government.
Almost a year ago today, Tehran-backed terrorists unleashed the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Ever since, they've continued to push this genocidal aim. Today, hundreds of rockets came from Tehran towards Israel, forcing millions into shelter. 2 terrorist attacks carried out. This Prime Minister has talked out of both sides of his mouth, saying one thing to one group, the opposite to another. Will the Prime Minister state clearly that Israel has the right to defend itself by defeating Hezbollah, Hamas, the IRGC, and all the other terrorists?
Wow, look at the conservative enthusiasm, eh? Unanimous.
Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we all seen the attacks by Iran against Israel today, and of course we condemn them unequivocally. These attacks from Iran will only serve to further escalate the region. And therefore, that is why I've been in contact with my Israeli counterpart this morning, and I've been in contact with many G7 foreign ministers as well as Arab countries' foreign ministers. This is a very dangerous time for the Middle East, and we need to make sure that this war stops.
Bro, the Palestinian state accounts on social media are sharing speeches that she gave.
The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton, please, to only take the floor when he is recognized to do so.
If you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything, eh?
Prairie. If the Liberals don't want an election now, then they have to support all seniors equally and fairly. That's why seniors advocacy groups are here today on the Hill. The FADOC and its Mauricie branch, the AQDR, the Outaouais AQRP and AREQ, the Table de Concertation des Aînés des Laurentides, they're all here today to ask the federal government to stop having 2 classes of seniors. They're here to demand a 10% increase in OAS for those 74 and under. Will the government finally listen to them? The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors. Mr. Speaker, we're shocked by what the Bloc Québécois is saying. Because what did they vote against? They voted against dental care, which is currently saving hundreds of dollars for hundreds of thousands of Quebecers and Canadians. We're shocked that the Bloc Québécois voted against the guaranteed income supplement and its increase. The GIS helps the least well-off seniors, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc Québécois is so hypocritical, and we are shocked. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. It is the International Day of Older Persons today. So suffice it to say that today's not the best day to avoid answering seniors' questions about OAS, especially not when seniors' representatives are here watching us. So we're going to give the Liberals another chance. They have until October 29th to stop depriving people aged 74 and under of 10% of their OAS. International Seniors Day would be the best possible day to announce that the Liberals are finally going to do it. So, will the Liberals give royal recommendation to C319, yes or no? The Honourable Minister
If they don't get it, they're going to
Seniors.
vote for non-confidence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to wish everyone happy International Seniors Day, especially representatives of the Outaouais Rec. Mr. Speaker, the member for La Prairie rises daily, but doesn't seem to remember that when it came time to vote to increase, that is, to decrease the retirement age to 65. What did the member for La Prairie do? He, in fact, voted against it. He wanted to keep the retirement age.
From Nunavut.
Another injustice, another day in court for the Liberals. Two Ontario First Nations are suing this government for their discriminatory underfunding of fire services in their communities. With climate change and aging infrastructure, First Nations are at higher risks. Instead of wasting more time in court, will the Liberals stop the discrimination against First Nations, truly commit to reconciliation, and deliver the funding needed to save lives?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is right. We all have to do more to protect the lives of Indigenous people, in particular First Nations children, who are many times more likely to die in a house fire than their non-Indigenous counterparts. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've invested over $136 million for First Nations self-determined projects to reduce the risks of fire, including making homes safer and ensuring equipment is available and working.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous people have a right to culturally informed community health care when they need it. But because of failed healthcare policies under the Liberal and Conservative governments, nearly 10 years since the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, healthcare gaps for Indigenous people have widened. So, Mr. Speaker, why won't the Prime Minister listen to Indigenous experts and leadership and design a healthcare system that ensures access to this basic human right?
I mean, that's not just for Indigenous, it's for all Canadians,
Mr. Speaker, in fact,
I would
that's
argue.
exactly what this government has done. In fact, with the renewed health transfers, separate money, $2 billion dedicated to First Nations leaders who are working on health transformation, self-determined healthcare services across this country. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, another 10 years of funding for the First Nations Health Authority to continue to plan and deliver health services for First Nations people in BC. We will get this work done together, Mr. Speaker.
Only in BC, eh?
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to quote one of the world's most credible news organizations on financial and economic matters. The Financial Times of London, May 10th, 2024. The headline: Breakdown nations like Canada have a lesson for the world. Canada leads nations which have suffered a sharp decline in per capita GDP. Simple question. Does the government agree that Canada leads nations that have suffered a sharp decline in per capita GDP?
Wow. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
What the government agrees with is that Canada was the first G7 country to lower interest rates for the first time. Canada
Gosh, such a freaking condescending, rotten undertone when she talks.
And Canada was the first G7 country to lower interest rates for a third time. The government also knows that wages in Canada have outpaced inflation for 19 months in a row. And meanwhile, inflation, 2% in August, has been within the Bank of Canada's target range.
Yeah.
Again, I'm going to invite members, please, not to take the floor unless they're being invited to by the chair. The Honourable Member from Halton Hills, Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Canada has become the first central bank to cut rates because Canada has become the first leading economy to go through an economic contraction. Again, the Financial Times, for which the finance minister once worked, it said, quote, Canada's per capita gross domestic product has been shrinking 0.4% a year since 2020, the worst rate for any developed economy in the top 50. Does the government agree that Canada's per capita GDP is shrinking at the worst rate of any of the top 50 economies?
Yeah. Look at the unanimous
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister
support from the Conservative bench.
Mr. Speaker, our government knows that what matters to Canadians is inflation. And that is why it is so important that inflation was 2% in August and that it has been within the Bank of Canada's target range all of this year. And it is because of that progress that that interest rates in Canada have come down 3 times. That is real relief to homeowners. That is real relief to businesses. That is real relief to anyone who wants to buy a home. But all the Conservatives know how to do is talk Canada down.
That's right.
She's off her rocker, man.
And ask the honourable member from Dufferin Caledon, please, to hold his time until he has the floor, which he often does during question period. The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, the government loves to tout its economic record, but the results are simply underwhelming.
Yes.
Canada has the worst housing inflation among its peers, the worst performance in per capita income among the G7, gross fixed capital formation has not increased in a decade, and R&D spending as a percent of GDP is at its lowest point in 20 years. It's no wonder why young Canadians and businesses are packing up in search of better economic opportunities and higher standards of living. When will the government admit that its economic policies are putting the future of Canada at risk?
Yeah.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
You know, Mr. Speaker, what I find so interesting about these Conservatives is the only thing they know how to do is talk Canada down. A couple of months ago,
our economy is trash right now.
About was inflation. But guess what? We have good news on inflation, and with that good news on inflation comes good news on interest rates. On this side of the House, we celebrate good news for Canada and Canadians. On that side of the House, all they want to do is break things and cut.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not surprised the minister is not persuaded by my comments, but perhaps you might listen to economist Trevor Tombe, who said if Canada had simply kept pace with the U.S. over the past 2 years, our economy would be 8.5% larger. That's $6,200 per person richer we would be. Wow. Trevor Tombe says that is an incentive for Canadians and businesses to move south of the border in search of greater economic opportunities and higher standards of living. Mr. Speaker, when the Deputy Prime Minister says that her economic plan is working, is this what she means?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we're even better than that, Mr. Speaker. We've attracted $60 billion of investment in this country, Mr. Speaker. Even Bloomberg put Canada ahead of China for the battery ecosystem in this country, Mr. Speaker. We have the talent, we have the ecosystem, we have the critical mineral, we have the renewable energy, we have the access to market.
Look at Freeland, nodding her head.
Let's talk about opportunities. Let's talk about Canada of the 21st century, Mr. Speaker. Let's be...
Hey, the Liberals look a little alive today. That's funny. The Chihuahua.
Colleagues, as we know, question period is of a limited time. I've been reminded that many times. I've allowed it to go on, but if we have to interrupt all the time, we might get to the point where we might need to end a question due to a little heckling. So I'll ask the honourable members to please not do so.